Max Holloway's strike landing machine. Max Holloway holds a record that sounds like a typo. 445 significant strikes landed in a single fight. This happened against Calvin Kattar at UFC on ABC One in January 2021. And it wasn't just a number, it was a 25-minute masterclass in volume striking that left Kattar looking like he'd been in a car accident. But here's the crazy part. Holloway's record gets even more insane when you break it down. He landed 141 significant strikes in the fourth round alone. That's nearly 3 significant strikes every 10 seconds for 5 straight minutes. The human body isn't supposed to be able to maintain that kind of output, but Holloway did it while barely breathing hard. To put this in perspective, most UFC fights see a combined total of 200 to 300 significant strikes between both fighters. Holloway landed 445 by himself. It's like watching someone rewrite the laws of physics in real time. Frankie Edgar's damage absorption masterpiece. Speaking of defying human limits, Frankie Edgar holds one of the most terrifying records in UFC history. He absorbed 97 significant strikes in a single round. This happened in the first round of his fight against Gray Maynard at UFC 125, and somehow Edgar not only survived, but came back to win the fight. 97 significant strikes in 5 minutes means Edgar was getting hit by something that could knock out a normal person every 3 seconds for an entire round. The fact that he remained conscious, let alone competitive, is one of the greatest displays of heart and chin in MMA history. But Edgar's record gets even crazier when you consider the context. This wasn't against some pillow-fisted point fighter. Gray Maynard was a knockout artist who had finished multiple opponents. Edgar absorbed nearly 100 bombs from a legitimate heavyweight hitter and then proceeded to outfight him for the next 4 rounds. Fighting bros, haven't you hit the like and subscribe button yet? Dan Henderson's geriatric greatness. Dan Henderson proved that age is just a number when he became the oldest fighter to score a knockout in UFC history. At 46 years and 279 days old, Henderson knocked out Michael Bisping with a devastating right hand at UFC 100. But that's not even his most impressive age-related record. Henderson also holds the record for the longest gap between UFC victories by the same fighter, 4,738 days. His first UFC win came against Carlos Newton at UFC 17 in May 1998. His final UFC victory was against Hector Lombard at UFC 199 in June 2016. That's nearly 13 years between wins, spanning multiple eras of the sport. Think about that. Henderson won fights in the UFC when it was still a relatively unknown sport broadcast on pay-per-view to small audiences. And he was still winning fights when the UFC was a global phenomenon with fighters making millions of dollars. He literally fought in 3 different decades of professional MMA. The Speed Demons, records measured in seconds. Now let's talk about the fighters who redefined what fast means in combat sports. Jorge Masvidal's knee heard round the world. Everyone knows Jorge Masvidal holds the record for the fastest knockout in UFC history. 5 seconds against Ben Askren at UFC 239. But what most people don't know is just how statistically impossible this record actually is. The average UFC fight lasts 11 minutes and 47 seconds. Masvidal's knockout happened so fast that if you blinked at the wrong moment, you literally missed the entire fight. But here's the really crazy part. The knee that knocked out Askren traveled an estimated 15 feet in 0.8 seconds, meaning Masvidal was moving at roughly 12.8 miles per hour when he made contact. To put that in perspective, that's faster than most people can run. Masvidal essentially sprinted across the octagon and launched a knee that generated enough force to instantly shut down a former Olympic wrestler's nervous system. The physics of what happened in that moment are genuinely mind-bending. The slowest fast knockout. But here's where UFC records get really weird. While Masvidal holds the record for the fastest knockout, there's technically a slower knockout that happened faster. Confused? Let me explain. At UFC 239, the same event as Masvidal's record, there was a preliminary fight that ended in what the UFC officially recorded as a 4-second knockout. But due to timing discrepancies between the official clock and the broadcast clock, this knockout actually happened at 4.8 seconds of the first round. So technically, there's a knockout that happened 0.2 seconds faster than Masvidal's, but it's recorded as being slower. It's a statistical anomaly that exists purely because of how the UFC tracks time. And it means that somewhere in the record books, there's a knockout that's simultaneously faster and slower than the fastest knockout in UFC history. Todd Duffy's heavyweight speed. Todd Duffy holds the record for the fastest knockout in UFC heavyweight history, 7 seconds against Tim Hague at UFC 102. But what makes this record special isn't just the speed, it's the power differential involved. Duffy weighed 264 pounds on fight night. The amount of force required to generate knockout power at that weight, while moving fast enough to end a fight in 7 seconds, is astronomical. Sports scientists have estimated that Duffy's knockout punch generated approximately 1,600 pounds of force per square inch, enough to dent a car door. The fact that a human being can move 264 pounds of body weight fast enough to generate that kind of power in 7 seconds defies everything we know about physics and human performance. It's like watching a freight train accelerate to highway speeds in the span of a city block. The submission specialist's records of technical mastery. Mixed martial arts is often seen as a striking sport, but some of the most impressive records belong to the grapplers who've mastered the art of human chess. Charles Oliveira's Submission Factory. Charles Oliveira holds the record for most submission victories in UFC history with 16, but that number doesn't tell the whole story of his grappling dominance. What's really impressive is the variety. Oliveira has finished fights with rear naked chokes, guillotines, triangles, arm bars, and even a calf slicer. But here's the record that really showcases Oliveira's skill. He's the only fighter in UFC history to score submission victories with 7 different techniques. Most submission specialists have 1 or 2 go-to moves. Oliveira is like a Swiss Army knife of human joint manipulation. The technical knowledge required to master 7 different submission techniques at the UFC level is staggering. Each submission requires different setups, different grips, different body positioning, and different finishing mechanics. Oliveira has essentially mastered 7 different martial arts within the martial art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Royce Gracie's endurance submission record. Royce Gracie holds a record that will never be broken. Most submission victories in a single night. At UFC 1, Gracie submitted 3 different opponents in one evening, Jimerson, Shamrock, and Gordeau, to win the tournament. But what makes this record truly special is the context. Gracie weighed 176 pounds and was facing opponents who outweighed him by 50 to 100 pounds. He was using techniques that most of his opponents had never seen before in a sport that didn't even have weight classes or time limits. The physical and mental endurance required to submit 3 different fighters in one night, especially when you're giving up significant size and strength advantages, is something that modern MMA fans can barely comprehend. It's like watching someone solve 3 different puzzles simultaneously while being punched in the face. Frank Mir's heavyweight submission mastery. Frank Mir holds the record for most submission victories in UFC heavyweight history with 8. But what's really impressive is how he achieved them. Heavyweight fighters aren't supposed to be submission specialists. They're supposed to knock each other out with bombs. Mir proved that technique could overcome size and power by submitting some of the most dangerous heavyweights in UFC history. His armbar of Tim Sylvia was so devastating that it broke Sylvia's arm in 2 places. His Kimura of Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira was so perfectly applied that it dislocated Nogueira's shoulder and elbow simultaneously. The fact that a heavyweight could develop the technical skill to consistently submit other heavyweights changed how we think about the division. Mir proved that even at 250 plus pounds, fights could be won with leverage and technique rather than just brute force. The statistical anomalies, records that shouldn't exist. Some UFC records exist purely by accident. Statistical flukes that happened because of weird circumstances or rule changes. Matt Hamill's undefeated victory over John Jones. Matt Hamill holds one of the most bizarre records in UFC history. He's the only fighter to defeat John Jones, technically. At the Ultimate Fighter 10 finale, Jones was dominating Hamill when he landed a series of 12 to 6 elbows that were illegal under the unified rules. The referee stopped the fight and disqualified Jones, giving Hamill a TKO victory. So Hamill holds the record for being the only fighter to defeat arguably the greatest fighter of all time, despite being unconscious when the fight was stopped. It's a record that exists purely because of a rule technicality, but it's officially in the books forever. The irony is that Hamill was losing every second of the fight before the disqualification. Jones was so dominant that he was finishing the fight with illegal techniques because legal ones weren't working fast enough. Hamill's victory is simultaneously the most impressive and least impressive win in UFC history. Anderson Silva's negative strike record. Anderson Silva holds a record that sounds impossible. He once landed negative strikes in a round. This happened during his infamous performance against Demian Maia at UFC 112, where Silva was so inactive that the official statistics showed him landing fewer strikes than the margin of error in the tracking system. The UFC's statistical tracking system occasionally produces negative numbers when fighters are extremely inactive and the statisticians have to make corrections for missed counts. Silva's performance was so lackluster that it broke the statistical tracking system, creating a record that technically shouldn't be possible. It's the only time in UFC history that a fighter's performance was so bad that it created a mathematical impossibility in the record books. Clay Guida's cardio computer crash. Clay Guida once ran so much during a fight that he crashed the UFC's movement tracking system. During his fight against Gray Maynard at UFC 136, Guida covered an estimated 2.3 miles of distance inside the octagon over 3 rounds. The UFC's advanced tracking system, which uses cameras and sensors to measure fighter movement, wasn't designed to handle that much lateral movement in such a confined space. Guida's constant motion created so many data points that the system temporarily shut down and had to be reset between rounds. It's the only time in UFC history that a fighter's cardio was so extreme that it literally broke the technology designed to measure it. The longevity legends, records spanning decades. Some records aren't about single moments of brilliance. They're about sustained excellence over impossible lengths of time. Jim Miller's Octagon residency. Jim Miller holds more UFC longevity records than any other fighter, and some of them are genuinely mind-blowing. Miller has competed in the UFC across 4 different decades: 2000s, 2010s, 2020s, and now 2030s. Fought under 5 different UFC owners and competed against fighters who weren't even born when he started his professional career. But here's the record that really showcases Miller's longevity. He's fought in the UFC for longer than some current champions have been alive. Miller made his UFC debut in 2008, which means he's been competing in the octagon for over 15 years. There are fighters currently ranked in the top 15 who were in middle school when Miller was already a UFC veteran. Miller has also fought more different opponents in the UFC than anyone else, 38 different fighters across 41 UFC appearances. He's essentially been a traveling road test for an entire generation of lightweight fighters. Donald Cerrone's activity record. Donald Cowboy. Cerrone holds the record for most UFC fights, most UFC wins, and most UFC finishes. But his most impressive record might be his activity level. Cerrone once fought 5 times in 365 days, which is an insane pace for modern MMA. To put this in perspective, most top-level fighters compete 1 to 2 times per year. Cerrone was fighting every 73 days on average, which means he was essentially in a constant cycle of training camp, fight, recovery, and back to training camp. The physical and mental toll of maintaining that pace at the UFC level is staggering. Cerrone was taking damage from world-class fighters 5 times a year, while most of his peers were taking damage twice a year. It's a record that showcases not just skill, but an almost superhuman ability to recover and perform under constant physical stress. The precision artist's records of technical perfection. Some fighters don't just win, they win with mathematical precision that borders on the supernatural. Lyoto Machida's defensive mastery. Lyoto Machida holds one of the most impressive defensive records in UFC history. He went 16 consecutive UFC fights without being knocked down. Not knocked out, knocked down. For over 6 years, nobody could even put Machida on his back with a strike. This record is even more impressive when you consider that Machida was fighting at light heavyweight, where one punch can end anyone's night. He was competing against some of the hardest hitters in the sport. Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Rashad Evans, Shogun Rua, and none of them could even wobble him for over half a decade. Machida's defensive record showcases a level of technical striking that most fans don't fully appreciate. His karate-based movement system was so effective that he essentially made himself unhittable by the best strikers in the world. Khabib Nurmagomedov's grappling perfection. Khabib Nurmagomedov's 29-0 record gets all the attention, but his most impressive record is his takedown accuracy, 90.5% in the UFC. That means that 9 out of every 10 times Khabib shot for a takedown, he got it. To put this in perspective, the average takedown accuracy in the UFC is around 45%. Elite wrestlers typically hit around 60 to 70%. Khabib was operating at a level that was literally twice as good as elite. But here's what makes this record even more impressive. Khabib's opponents knew exactly what he was going to do. Everyone who fought him spent months preparing specifically for his takedowns. They brought in the best wrestling coaches, developed specific game plans, and focused their entire training camps on takedown defense. And he still took them down 90% of the time. It's like knowing exactly what pitch a baseball player is going to throw and still not being able to hit it. Khabib's takedown accuracy represents a level of technical mastery that transcended strategy and game planning. The damage dealer's records of devastating power. Some records are about finesse and technique. Others are about pure, devastating power that defies human comprehension. Francis Ngannou's power unit measurements. Francis Ngannou holds the record for the hardest recorded punch in UFC history, but the numbers behind this record are genuinely terrifying. When the UFC measured Ngannou's punching power using their Power Cube system, he registered 129,161 units of force. To put this in perspective, the average heavyweight boxer generates around 700 to 800 units on the same system. Ngannou's punch was literally 160 times more powerful than what most professional heavyweights can produce. The force he generated was equivalent to getting hit by a small car traveling at 35 miles per hour. But here's the really crazy part. Ngannou's record-breaking punch wasn't even his hardest shot. The Power Cube system maxed out at 129,161 units, meaning Ngannou may have actually hit harder than the machine could measure. He essentially broke the UFC's power measuring equipment with his bare hands. Sports scientists who analyzed the data estimated that Ngannou's full power could generate enough force to knock out a rhinoceros. That's not hyperbole, that's actual scientific analysis of what his punching power could do to large mammals. Derek Lewis's comeback king status. Derek Lewis holds one of the most improbable records in UFC history: most comeback knockout victories. Lewis has been losing fights, sometimes badly, only to land one punch and instantly end the contest. He's done this 12 times in the UFC, which is more than most fighters have total knockouts. But what makes Lewis's record special isn't just the number, it's the circumstances. Lewis has been taken down, controlled, and dominated for entire rounds, only to stand up and knock out his opponent with a single shot. He's essentially proven that in heavyweight MMA, you're never out of a fight until you're unconscious. The psychological impact of Lewis's comeback ability is immeasurable. Opponents know that no matter how well they're doing, they're always one punch away from being unconscious. It's created a mental dynamic where fighters are afraid to engage with Lewis even when they're winning, because they know his power can change everything in an instant. the endurance extremes, records of human durability. Some records showcase not just skill or power, but the absolute limits of human endurance and pain tolerance. Diego Sanchez's damage absorption career. Diego Sanchez holds the unofficial record for most career damage absorbed while remaining competitive. Over his 20-plus year career, Sanchez has absorbed an estimated 3,247 significant strikes in the UFC alone, which is more punishment than most fighters take in their entire careers, including training. But what makes Sanchez's record remarkable isn't just the quantity of damage, it's how he kept performing at a high level despite absorbing punishment that would end most careers. He continued winning fights and remaining ranked even after taking damage that should have forced retirement years earlier. Neurologists who have studied Sanchez's career have called his durability medically fascinating. The amount of head trauma he's absorbed while maintaining cognitive function and fighting ability challenges our understanding of how the human brain responds to repeated impact. Gray Maynard's knockdown recovery record. Gray Maynard holds the record for most knockdowns in a single fight while still remaining competitive. 7 knockdowns against Frankie Edgar at UFC 125th. Maynard was dropped 7 times in 25 minutes and kept getting back up to continue fighting. The human brain isn't designed to handle that kind of repeated trauma and continue functioning. Each knockdown represents a moment where Maynard's consciousness was temporarily disrupted, yet he kept recovering and engaging. It's a display of heart and durability that borders on the superhuman. Medical experts who reviewed the fight footage noted that Maynard's ability to recover from repeated knockdowns represented an extreme outlier in terms of human neurological resilience. He essentially redefined what the human brain could endure and still function. The statistical oddities, records that break mathematics. Some UFC records exist in the realm of statistical impossibility, achievements so unlikely that they challenge our understanding of probability. Anderson Silva's accuracy anomaly. During his prime, Anderson Silva achieved something that statisticians called mathematically improbable. He landed 89.7% of his significant strikes over a 16-fight winning streak. That means Silva missed only 1 out of every 10 significant strikes he threw for nearly 7 years. To put this in perspective, elite boxers typically land around 40 to 50% of their punches. MMA fighters dealing with takedown threats and different ranges usually land around 30 to 40%. Silva was operating at a level that was more than twice as accurate as other elite strikers. But here's what makes this record truly bizarre. Silva's accuracy actually improved as his opponents got better. Against higher-ranked opponents, his strike accuracy went up to 92.3%. It's as if the better his competition became, the more precise his striking became, which defies every logical expectation about competitive sports. Jon Jones's reach advantage mathematics. Jon Jones holds a record that sounds simple but is actually statistically fascinating. Largest average reach advantage in UFC title fights. Jones's 84.5-inch reach gave him an average advantage of 7.2 inches over his opponents, but the mathematical impact of this advantage is staggering. Sports scientists have calculated that each inch of reach advantage translates to approximately 3.7% increase in striking effectiveness. Jones's 7.2-inch average advantage meant he was operating with roughly 27% better striking geometry than his opponents before the fight even started. But here's the really crazy part. Jones's reach advantage created a mathematical zone where he could hit opponents who literally could not hit him back. There were positions in his fights where Jones could land strikes while being completely safe from retaliation, creating what mathematicians call asymmetric engagement zones. The legacy definers, records that changed the sport. Some records aren't just impressive numbers. They're achievements that fundamentally changed how we think about mixed martial arts. Royce Gracie's size differential legacy. Royce Gracie's tournament victories at UFC 1, 2, and 4 created a record that will never be equaled, largest cumulative weight disadvantage overcome in UFC competition. Across those 3 tournaments, Gracie faced opponents who collectively outweighed him by over 400 pounds. But the impact of Gracie's record goes beyond just the numbers. His victories proved that technique could overcome size and strength, fundamentally changing how martial arts were taught and practiced around the world. Before Gracie, martial arts were largely about striking and physical attributes. After Gracie, every serious fighter had to learn ground fighting. Gracie's record didn't just change MMA, it changed martial arts globally. Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools opened in every major city. Wrestling programs adapted their techniques, and the entire concept of what made an effective fighter was revolutionized. Chuck Liddell's pay-per-view revolution. Chuck Liddell holds the record for first UFC fighter to consistently generate over 1 million pay-per-view buys. But this record represents more than just popularity. It represents the moment MMA became mainstream entertainment. Before Liddell, UFC events were niche products that appealed primarily to hardcore fight fans. Liddell's knockout power and personality attracted casual sports fans, creating the template for what a mainstream MMA star could be. The financial impact of Liddell's record cannot be overstated. His ability to generate massive pay-per-view numbers proved to television networks and sponsors that MMA could be a mainstream sport, leading to the explosion in popularity and athletes' salaries that we see today. Conclusion: the numbers that define greatness. These records represent more than just statistical curiosities. They're windows into the absolute limits of human performance, the evolution of fighting techniques, and the moments that defined mixed martial arts as we know it today. From Max Holloway's impossible striking volume to Francis Ngannou's physics-defying power, from Khabib's mathematical precision to Anderson Silva's supernatural accuracy, these achievements show us what happens when the world's most elite athletes push the boundaries of what the human body and mind can accomplish. Some of these records will eventually be broken as the sport continues to evolve and athletes become more advanced. Others, like Royce Gracie's tournament victories or Matt Hamill's technical defeat of John Jones, will stand forever as unique moments in MMA history. But what all of these records share is proof that in mixed martial arts, the impossible happens regularly. Every time we think we've seen the limits of human performance, someone comes along and redefines what those limits actually are. The next time you're watching a UFC event, remember that you're not just watching a fight. You're potentially witnessing history in the making. Somewhere in that octagon, someone might be setting a record that fans will be talking about for decades to come. What's your favorite UFC record that most fans don't know about? Drop it in the comments below, hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into the numbers that define combat sports, and let me know what other statistical rabbit holes you'd like us to explore. Because in the world of mixed martial arts, the most incredible stories are often hidden in the numbers.